In a horrific moment of just awful injury luck, Alexandre Pantoja suffered a gruesome left arm injury just seconds into his fight at UFC 323. And in this video, we'll take a closer look at what exactly happened here, the mechanism of injury, and what he could be looking at for his ultimate recovery. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and the goal in this channel is to teach you more about the medical side of the sports world. So I know what this looked like was a broken arm, but in fact, I'm almost certain this was an elbow joint dislocation. As Pantoja is going down to the mat here, he extends his left arm to help brace his fall. And by extending that arm, you're essentially trying to lock the bony contours of the joint. And so anything in this whole chain of, joints here, the elbow joint, the shoulder joint, is trying to absorb and stabilize itself to protect the impact of that momentum as you're coming down to the canvas. In his case, what's going to happen is he suffers this, what looks like a valgus load, where his elbow almost wants to bend inward, and that elbow bending inward is ultimately going to lead to what looks like an elbow joint dislocation. The big tell here too is Pantoja is rolling on his back and waving for the fight to be stopped, is that you can see how there's this little deformity, this little step off that we're seeing, that indentation on the backside of his arm. And what typically will happen with an elbow joint dislocation is the olecranon, the bone we'll talk about here in a little bit with our anatomy model, gets displaced posterior, and you see this indentation, this dip in the backside of the elbow, where the triceps is going to go down and insert onto that olecranon, from the olecranon being displaced posterior. Thankfully, as they were taking him off back to the locker room, it looked like everything was back in proper position. I don't know if we missed them reducing it there in the octagon, or if it just went back in on its own, because sometimes that will happen. But it looks like here we see nice normal contour. Hopefully things are back in place where they need to be as he's making his way back into the locker room. Next, we'll dive into a little bit more of what can happen in terms of what structures are damaged and how something like this will be treated. But first, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video. Today's video is sponsored by The Feed. The Feed is the world's largest sports nutrition marketplace and where athletes get fed. On a daily basis, I'm consuming protein bars, protein powder, creatine, hydration products, and it's really complicated trying to figure out where to get all that stuff from different places. But The Feed simplifies this by offering over 10,000 curated products from your favorite brands, all in one simple and easy to shop location. And listen up, because if you scan this QR code or head to thefeed.com/Brian, you're gonna get 40% off your first purchase. The Feed's website makes all this extremely simple. You can break it down between hydration products, carbohydrates, protein, other supplements like your pre-workout, sleep, recovery, creatine. Click into each of those and immediately you see all the different brands and servings, flavors that they offer. And probably my favorite part is if you want to try a bunch of different flavors, for example, protein bars, you can buy individual bars without committing to a full box or a full package. Stop going to a dozen different stores and websites to get your sports nutrition products. The Feed has everything you need all in one. So scan the QR code on screen or head to thefeed.com/Brian to again get 40% off your first purchase. The Feed is trusted by Olympians, world champions, and everyday athletes like you and I. Thank you again to The Feed for sponsoring today's video, and let's get back to our learning. Going to our biodigital anatomy tool here, let's talk about these key structures that are going to be involved with this type of an injury. Now, I will say certainly on the differential is going to be something like a distal humerus fracture, or specifically what we'd call a supracondylar fracture. I still don't think that's what we're dealing with, just because of the position, the mechanism, that kind of landing on an outstretched arm. I think far more likely this was an elbow dislocation than a fracture, but certainly fracture still, of course, on the differential. And you can also have a fracture when you dislocate your elbow. The condyles of the elbow are going to be the lower parts of the humerus. So let's get rid of some of our capsule tissue here, get rid of some of these bursa, get rid of the cartilage, our olecranon bursa on the backside. And here we go, really nice view. So this inner part, this inner contour is going to be the medial epicondyle. The lateral outer part is going to be the lateral epicondyle. A supracondylar fracture is where there's a fracture above those two condyles. So that is one thing on the differential here for what could happen. But again, I still think elbow dislocation is the most likely sort of an injury. I just mentioned that little indentation that we see whenever there's an elbow dislocation. So we describe an elbow dislocation based on the position of the olecranon, which is the ulna, relative to the humerus. So a posterior dislocation is going to be back this direction. That's going to be the much more common type of injury we'll see, and what I would suspect we saw happen with Alexandre. Now, whenever that happens, we describe them in two different ways, simple or complex. A simple joint dislocation, elbow or otherwise, is going to be a dislocation only where there is no fracture. A complex dislocation is going to be when there is a fracture associated with the joint being out of place. In the case of an elbow dislocation, a very common location to have a fracture is the coronoid process. That's going to be this little tip, this little bump on the front anterior part of the ulna, because you can imagine as that ulnohumeral joint completely dislocates posterior, you can have this coronoid bang against the underside of the bone and cause a break in that coronoid. You are also going to have disruption, tearing of these ligaments. You expect these ligaments are torn. The ligaments are torn because that's what allows the joint to go out of place. In the case of Pantoja, what I think happened was there was this added rotational component to it, probably tore completely his ulnar collateral ligament sitting on the inside of the elbow. There is often some tearing of the lateral or radial collateral ligament on the outside of the elbow. And so there is often very extensive soft tissue damage that goes along with an elbow dislocation, even if there is not a fracture. Of course, the cartilage can also get injured and surrounding nerves, blood vessels, etc. When Pantoja's in this position, this is that valgus stress I'm talking about. So that elbow is wanting to bend inward. And I think what likely happened, if this is in fact a dislocation, is that ulnar collateral ligament sitting here on the inside is going to fail. That's going to make the joint unstable. His momentum, the load continues to carry through with that ground reaction force pushing up through. And then we ultimately will see this little like rotation. There's this subtle little rotation that we see in here. That is when I think the joint completely dislocated. Unlike a finger, a shoulder dislocation, an elbow dislocation can be extremely hard to reduce, and oftentimes you have to get somebody to the hospital, sedation, and then get it back put in place. There's also a lot of very important blood vessels and nerve structures that run around the elbow, the median nerve, the ulnar nerve, radial nerve, arteries in the front. And so with any joint dislocation, but especially something like the elbow, you've absolutely got to make sure that they have good neurovascular exam before and after you reduce the joint. Treatment here is very broad, depending on just the situation with the individual athlete, their sport, and then what injuries occur. If there is a fracture, it's more likely that the joint is going to continue to be unstable after it's put back in place. That's more likely to require surgery to fix the fracture, to restore the stability to the joint. If there's no fracture and it's just a simple dislocation, we'll often put them in a splint, immobilize the elbow for a couple of weeks, but then assuming that there's gross stability there, you rarely need surgery for a simple elbow dislocation. Now, a lot of that is sport specific, right? If you've got a high level baseball player who it's their dominant side, there's going to be damage to the ulnar collateral ligament. Most likely, you're probably going to have surgery to reconstruct it. If it's the non-dominant side of an athlete, now mixed martial arts a little bit different, right? You're grappling, there's a lot more load, there's landing, etc. Those are the individual cases where, depending on the athlete, depending on how they heal and recover, surgery may be more likely in certain circumstances. But for just the average individual, the average person who has a simple elbow dislocation, very, very unlikely to have surgery to be required. So step one, make sure the joint is back in place if this is in fact what happened. Step two, neurovascular exam. Step three, see if there's any fracture. If there's fracture, the joint's unstable, he's likely headed for surgery. If there's no fracture, let it calm down, stabilize it, assess the stability in the following 1 to 2 weeks, and then consider surgery depending on the individual circumstances. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.